Hello everybody and welcome to today's lecture. My name's Denny Wells, I'm from the University of Western Australia, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Vicon and other marker-based motion analysis systems. We're going to go through what they are, how they work and why we use them. Just a little bit of background on me. I grew up in country WA in a little town called Wildcatcham. From there I went to Perth and studied at the University of Western Australia, where I got my Bachelor of Science with honours and am now almost finished my PhD. I've been looking at upper limb modelling specifically for sporting applications. Through my PhD I've looked at particular research topics, particularly involving modelling the upper limb. I've been looking at existing technologies and techniques and how we use them, but also looking at new, innovative and novel techniques to solve existing problems. Through this I've developed a skill set which includes how we model the human body, modelling with OpenSim, which is a program you might come across during your course, but relevant to today, motion capture and modelling with Vicon technology and marker-based motion systems. So today's lecture is going to consist of 3 segments, roughly 20 minutes each. Firstly, we're going to look at marker-based motion capture systems, what they are, how they work, the hardware behind them, how they function. Next, we're going to look at marker-based motion data, so the data we actually obtain from these systems, how we use it to obtain what we're looking for. Lastly, we're going to look at how these systems are used in particular applications. I've got here sporting applications, but we'll also touch on some other applications as well. Alright, let's get straight into it. So, the purpose of motion capture is to record human movement for further assessment. If we're talking about a biomechanical assessment, this implies that we're going to apply some mechanical concepts to biological systems. For example, calculating the positions of body segments, perhaps the angle between 2 segments, some relative accelerations, or even some forces acting along and through these segments. Now, many people will already be familiar with at least one form of motion capture, video. Video is great. It's easily accessible, it's easy to communicate, and everybody is familiar with it. Here we have a cricket bowler, and just using some free software, Canovia, I've digitized a knee center of rotation and a knee and a hip and an ankle, and that gives us knee flexion angle as this bowler is performing his action. However, there is a lot of subjectivity involved in this process. I have just visually assessed where these joint centers are, and it's given me an angle. However, there's obviously some degree of subjective error in there. The other issue is that it is a 2-dimensional medium, video, and this can result in what's called perception error. And this is where we are trying to measure a 3-dimensional angle in 2 dimensions. And as you can see here, we have 2 simultaneously captured images. However, if we were to try and assess elbow angle from this point, from here, we would get a very different value for this angle from the rear compared with what we get if we were measuring from the side. And yes, so this is called perception error, and it happens with all 2D systems, including visual assessment. So if we were just standing there watching somebody perform an action, we would have some form of this error. And this is where the power of marker-based systems really comes into its own. Firstly, it's automated and it removes some of, but not all, of the subjectivity of identifying structures such as joint centers or anatomical landmarks, but it also allows us to record 3D motions in 3D. Now, in order to do this, we need a lot of equipment. So this is a cricket bowler testing session we did for UWA. And as you can see here, we have a number of cameras set up and a computer system on the left there. And this took about 1.5 to 2 hours just to set up the equipment. And after that, we still have to perform the calibrations and prepare the actual system before the participant even comes in to perform the cricket bowling motion. So, the system. I'll quickly run through what comprises this motion capture system. Firstly, and most obviously, we have the main camera array. Now this is set up around a specified capture volume. The capture volume is the area that's going to be most accurately recorded by the cameras, and it's calibrated in a way to do that. So the cameras surround our capture volume, covering every point, and then these cameras send all their signals to what is called the system hub, the Giganet or Lock Plus sync box in terms of Vicon hardware. So this box is quite powerful. It receives, synchronizes and compiles all the signals before sending them through to the host PC. But it also allows the user input from the PC to be relayed to all the attached peripheral equipment. You can also include video camera, high-speed synchronized video camera. Now I'll just explain why video is not a great motion capture solution in some problems, but it can still be very powerful, and I'll show you why later. You can also add into the system other peripheral devices, for example force plates, EMG, we can measure muscle activation and synchronize that with our motion data, or things such as timing gates, which can be used to trigger the system to begin recording as a participant passes through a set point in, say, as they enter our capture volume. Finally, we have our host computer, which is generally quite a powerful unit to enable to process all this data as it is fed in from the system hub. This is used to display and record the system, the motion data, and also as an interface for the user, so that start-stop capture as well as calibrating the system and tweaking settings prior to the data capture beginning. Now, that is a lot of equipment for a single motion capture session, and it can look quite overwhelming, and you get very used to dealing with cables, but it is worth it, and I'll begin to show you why now. So, how our main cameras work is that they don't record visual light, as in video, they actually record infrared points. Now this infrared is initially emitted by the strobe, which is this circle configuration of LEDs surrounding the lens of the camera. So the strobe emits the infrared, and then it is reflected by these special markers which are placed on the participant and reflected back into the camera where it is recorded. So where you place the markers on your participant will depend on the kind of analysis you're doing. If you're doing a gait analysis, they're on the lower limb. If you're doing a cricket analysis, looking at the arm, they'll be on the upper limb. You might do a full body set. They'll generally come in either single or cluster configurations, clusters of 3 or 4 markers for specific modelling reasons. Now this kind of system is what's called a passive system, in that the markers don't actually emit any light. They reflect light that is already in the environment, in this case emitted by the strobe. There do exist active systems where the markers emit light, making them much more easily trackable by the camera systems involved in those. However, in that case you need battery packs on the participant and wires running across the body. They're generally not widely used for sporting analyses, but they do exist. If a camera picks up a signal of infrared light that's been reflected off a marker back into the lens, it'll light up the pixels on the sensor. A good signal will equal a round circle where it's picking up a round marker, and the software is able to recognize this and is able to automatically track the markers that it picks up. This process is called circle fitting. So the more pixels that are lit up by the reflected infrared light, the better the circle, the easier the software can track the markers. Now at this point, there is a trade-off. We can increase the resolution of the cameras and have nicer circles and better circle fits, but this decreases the maximum frame rate that we can capture at, and frame rate becomes very important if we're looking at high speed activities or high impact activities. We want to maximize the amount of resolution that we have to have the best signal and the best data, but we might need to trade that off with some in order to be able to capture at a high enough rate to be able to correctly observe the movement in action. And the cameras I have worked with have been the T40 series from Vicon, and these have been 4 megapixel, and we usually capture at about 250 frames per second, and it becomes quite obvious when working with, for example, our cricket bowlers again, that at 250 frames for a fast bowler, you're still not getting a huge amount of data. You may be getting 15 to 20 frames of data that you're dealing with. So if we can increase that frame rate, or as technology improves, we can increase that frame rate, but we also can maximize our resolution. Now the new system of cameras released by Vicon, the Vantage, they have improved on the T40s in both resolution and maximum frame rates. So depending on what you want to go for, you can have the V16 cameras capturing at 16 megapixels but only at 120 hertz or frames per second. So these cameras might be used for highly detailed motion capture. We've got lots of markers in a close space, only performing slow movements, maybe for a gait analysis or on children where the markers might be smaller and closer together. At the other end, you've got the V5. So the resolution, it's still improved on the T40s, but it's the lowest of the new cameras. However, it has a maximum frame rate of up to 420 frames per second. So we're really getting a lot of data. We can start looking at really very high acceleration and velocity movements with those cameras. Now, a single frame from one of these cameras, or a single trial from one of these cameras, might look something like this. So here's our cricket bowler coming in, performing the bowling action. Here the camera is in the front and slightly to the right of the bowler as they perform the action. You might be able to make out where the skeleton or where the participant would be relative to those markers. Each of those yellow crosshairs is where the system has recognized a circle, a marker, and performed a circle fit. And these blued out areas in the background are actually other cameras in the system, and we blank those out because they're emitting infrared from the strobe. We have to blank them out. And if you have multiple cameras, remember our camera array consisted of a lot of cameras, and we get camera angles from all around the person as they perform, and you get something that looks like this. So there we have 22 different views of the same action, all simultaneously recorded, all looking at the same markers. Now, if we are to calibrate the system and give it a common reference frame, or a global coordinate system as it's known, then we can begin to look at data in 3D. So we can recreate our trial, and as we start looking around here, you can see all of our cameras in our array recreated in three-dimensional space. The system has been calibrated so that all the cameras know where they are compared to the capture volume. And now we have three-dimensional data. Our markers have been recreated within 3D space. And this is great. We can pause this, we can spin around, have a look. You can start, well, you might be able to see now, if you couldn't before, where the participant would be within those markers. The two legs, we've got a back view now as the person finishes the delivery. And that's great. We've recorded our motion in 3 dimensions. and we've got some really nice looking data here. But that's not going to help anyone. We still need to process the data in order to get out meaningful values such as joint angles, and that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, welcome back. So, on to part 2. We've recorded our motion data, our 3D marker trajectory data. What do we do next? How do we use that data? First step, each marker has been positioned for a specific reason. Whether this has some anatomical relevance, for example on a bony landmark, or if it is just placed on a particular segment, and this is generally what our triads are for. We just arbitrarily place the triads on the segments for certain models. So the first step we perform with our marker data is we allocate a name and label to each of them. So now we can begin to create our little marker man here, and it's starting to take a bit of form now. It looks a bit more human, but this still isn't useful or meaningful data. It's still just some dots, just now they're coloured with some lines in between, and it just looks a little bit prettier, but it's an important step as we move on to begin to model our data. And in order to do that, we have to look a little bit closer at the data that we've collected. So what we can do is we can open up our data file and look at the individual numbers that we have recorded. So what we've looked at so far, those dots in the 3D space, that's purely a visual representation of this. what we have here is, across the top, we have the names that we've allocated to 3 markers. In this case, it's a triad, a cluster of markers on the acromion. We've got marker 1, marker 2, and marker 3. Each of those markers has an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate value. Remember, we're in 3D space, so we've got an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate, and this is its position in the global coordinate system, or the global reference frame, which I mentioned a bit earlier. And it has a set of X, Y, Z coordinates for every single frame of data that we've captured. So remember, data being captured at 250 Hertz, or 250 frames per second. That means for every second, there's 250 sets of coordinates for that marker. So you can see along the left-hand side here, the progression for each of the time points is 0.004 of a second. So if you divide 1 second by our frame rate, our capture rate of 250, that will equal 0.004. And it also, our data starts here at 1 second 42, and that's because I've simply taken a sample from within the middle of a trial when all 3 markers are present, so we have data for each of these 3 markers. Now, it's not the most interesting data, and it doesn't look as cool as the visualization, but it is important to understand that when we start manipulating and modeling our data, that we're not modeling dots floating in a black visual space. We're actually manipulating these numbers. Now remember, these coordinates are expressed in the global coordinate system. Now the global coordinate system is defined during our calibration in the early stages after we've set up our equipment. But it usually corresponds to a spot about in the middle of the capture volume, but on the level of the floor. So in biomechanics, the x-axis generally indicates forward movement through the volume, y is up, and z to the right. So we can simply recreate our RACR1 marker within our global coordinate system by travelling 46.4 centimeters in the minus x direction, 144.7 centimeters in the positive y direction, and then 33.3 centimeters in the negative z direction. And that's where our RACR1 marker will be located. Using our marker data, we can now begin to calculate joint centers. For example, here we have a knee joint center, which is simply the midpoint of the knee medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. Joint centers can be calculated in any number of ways, including regression equations, which might take into account participant-specific variables such as height, mass, gender, or simple midpoints such as this. When you have 2 joint centers, so here we're going to define an ankle joint center at the bottom of the lower leg, we can then define a rigid segment between these 2 points, and this becomes our lower leg segment. With the additional information of joint centers, we are now able to calculate further coordinate systems. So we're going to get a little bit inception here. We're going to calculate coordinate systems within coordinate systems. And this is the convention for expressing coordinate systems within coordinate systems. So this is our y-axis of the lower leg coordinate system expressed within the global coordinate system. Now, say we express a couple of anatomical coordinate systems. We have a thigh and a lower leg anatomical coordinate system, and we've expressed them both in the global. So we can obtain our pose information, position and orientation information, for each of those segments independently. However, if we go another level down into our inception analogy, and we express our lower leg coordinate system within our thigh coordinate system, then we can get relative joint angles, in this case for the knee joint. And here's a visualization of that. So here we have our global coordinate system, the origin of which is located in the floor. And then we have two anatomical coordinate systems. One for the thigh, with the origin at the hip joint center of rotation, and one at the knee, which, although it looks like it's in the femur, is associated with the lower leg. It's simply the origin is at the knee center of rotation. So an orientation around our z-axis can now be described as knee flexion extension. Remember, we're expressing this coordinate system within this one. If we go to a frontal view, a rotation about the x-axis of the lower leg coordinate system is knee varus valgus. And finally, a longitudinal rotation about the y-axis, knee internal and external rotation. So here we have two anatomical coordinate systems. However, there are more than two segments in the body, and if your research question required it, you can define anatomical coordinate systems for every rigid segment that you need. So here this can look a bit daunting, but it can be a very powerful system. Here we can see a shoulder joint center giving us shoulder angles, elbow, also pronation supination between the radius and the ulna, and then hip, knee, ankle, and some feet. And if you want to go even further, if your data will allow it, you can get into some really fine detail. So, to recap, we experimentally capture our external marker data using our 3D motion capture system, in this case Vicon. Using that marker data, we can define joint centers and segments between those joint centers. Using further use of that marker data, we can define anatomical coordinate systems, and we can begin to describe rotations between two segments, angles between two segments, using those three axes of rotation. So here is our marker data of the cricket bowler from before. We'd labelled them previously. Now we've modelled our data, and you can see some joint centres there. We might just have to wait until we zoom in a bit on the data to see them a bit better. And we can now export that data, and we have our readings for each of the joint angles throughout this entire movement. There we go, you can see some elbow, hip, knee joint centres there. You might also notice a big grey square with a number 1 on the floor and an arrow coming out of it. And I'm going to tell you what that is in the next segment. One of the most powerful properties of marker-based motion analysis is our ability to integrate marker data with other data sources. This allows for even more advanced analyses stretching beyond body segment pose information. I'm just briefly going to touch on some of these other measuring devices now. Picking up from where we left off in the previous video, we can see that as well as our marker trajectories, we have collected some other kind of data for this trial. The grey square on the ground represents a force plate, and the arrow coming from it is its ground reaction force, which is the force the ground is expressing back onto the body. Now remember, every action has an opposite and equal reaction. So if we land on the ground reacts with force on the foot, and force plates allows us to measure that. So force plates can report in 3 dimensions. They're able to measure the force anterior, posterior, laterally, left and right, and downwards. Now when we're moving in air, there is no, we can't create an upwards force. However, if you're underwater and you pushed off a wall, that would create a suction, which might produce a force in that direction. Now when we consider the body to be a series of rigid segments, we can calculate the joint moments up the segments of the body from where the body is contacting the force plate. And this is incredibly useful for the investigation of mechanisms of injuries, and I'll touch on that more later. Another form of data is video. And whilst video isn't great for motion analysis in three-dimensional movement, it is an incredibly powerful form of feedback. By combining video with 3D analysis, we can better communicate complex concepts. For example, athletes who may not have undergone a marker-based analysis before won't understand or be able to interpret a group of dots flying across the screen. But when we overlay video, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier to communicate between biomechanists or testers and the athletes and their coaches. EMG, or electromyography, measures the activation of muscles. So if we can record EMG simultaneously with our marker data, we can then pinpoint muscle activation patterns, and compare contraction strengths. In conjunction with marker data, this presents an amazingly powerful tool, which not only measures external parameters, body segment pose information from our marker data, but also internal characteristics, such as when do certain muscle groups activate during a movement? Does any co-contraction occur? What movement are we seeing when certain muscles activate, or even what muscle activations produce what movements? Eye tracking equipment allows the measurement of sight variables such as points of focus and focus durations. This is usually performed with a screen depicting a game type scenario, requiring an athlete to make some decision based on visual cues. If we can measure and quantify elite athlete focus traits and patterns, then perhaps we can begin to teach these to young or sub-elite athletes and start fast-tracking their development. That's it for this section. We're back shortly to go through the applications of this data, specific applications and research questions. Alright, see you soon. For the final section of today's lecture, I'll be discussing some of the applications of marker data and also some of the current research being performed which utilises marker-based motion capture. I'll begin with some sports-based studies before widening into other areas of research, and then also including some applications outside of research that use marker data. So the investigation of injury etiology is an increasingly relevant and important area of research, gaining more and more attention. ACL injuries, for example, are extremely common and place a huge burden on both individual athletes and sporting teams, as well as the national healthcare systems. Now, through the use of force plates and marker-based motion capture, we are learning more about ACL injury patterns and from this able to formulate prevention strategies. We now know that ACL ruptures occur with a combination of knee extension, knee valgus, and internal and external rotation. Marker-based analyses can be used to identify people at a high risk of ACL injury, most often through a technique such as this, where we measure their kinematics, lower limb kinematics, and joint moments when performing a side-stepping or cutting manoeuvre. Now, if somebody's found to be at high risk of an ACL injury through one of these assessments, we can then prescribe an intervention and they can undergo a training regime to lessen these moments, most often by strengthening their core and the glutes, especially glute medius. After an intervention, we can reassess them, retest, and see and quantify any improvement to their kinematics and joint moments. If they have improved, we might be able to move them from the at-risk category. The research in this area is still ongoing. At the moment, they're looking at, in particular, long-term interventions and prevention strategies. Other applications, sporting-based applications and areas of research are as varied as the sports themselves. For example, in cricket, one area of research is looking at lumbar loading in fast bowlers. Now, fast bowlers can experience up to 9 times body weight of force going through their front leg when they land, and this has led to a huge issue with stress fractures in young and developing bowlers. So they're looking at techniques and technique modifications to reduce the instances of stress fractures. It can also be used to measure the elbow angle, and the chucking law or throwing controversy is a relatively hot topic in cricket at the moment. In AFL, there's studies being done to improve kicking distance and kicking accuracy, measuring the kinematics, the ball drop, the ball spin generated, all using marker-based motion capture. In gymnastics, where gymnasts may experience up to 16 times their body weight, these are some of the largest forces ever measured by any athlete. 16 times their body weight going through their legs and bodies when they land on the more extreme stunts and manoeuvres. So they have lots of issues with impact injuries. And by investigating their technique and being able to tweak their technique and change their technique to have the best landing possible, we can reduce those instances, all through using marker-based motion capture. In tennis, there's been a lot of research done on shoulder and elbow motion and actions during serving. This has been performed for both improving performance as well as decreasing instances of injury. In rugby, the hot topic at the moment is concussion reduction and tackle techniques, which overlap there's a fair bit of overlap between the two. And concussions especially are causing huge issues in contact sports. So that's not just in rugby, but in AFL and NFL and all contact sports. Concussion is a big issue at the moment. So looking at how
tackling is performed, but also the forces that go through the head and how a person responds to contact using accelerations, which you can measure with muscle marker-based motion capture. They're looking to improve concussion protocols and also reduce the instances of concussion. And in netball, improving the reliability and repeatability of shooting characteristics. So measuring what makes a good shooter and then being able to teach those techniques to other shooters. Now, there is an increasing body of research investigating what makes an athlete an elite athlete. And this is particularly being driven by team sports such as AFL, the rugby codes and soccer, where talent identification is playing more and more of a role in a team success and also an athlete success. So using marker data and marker motion capture in conjunction with eye tracking, we can measure a number of variables, for example reaction times, as well as decision making, for example moving in the correct direction to avoid defenders. Using the eye tracking, we can also measure where an athlete is looking during a certain situation or a certain scenario. For example, it has been found that elite athletes will select more central focal zones, whilst amateur level athletes will tend to not settle and will move their focus constantly. Also, and maybe unsurprisingly, elite athletes have faster reaction times than amateur athletes. But does shifting from an amateur towards an elite athlete result in improved reaction times? For example, improving focal points? Or does improving reaction times move an athlete closer to being elite? It's just something to think about. I'm just going to touch on some other areas of research now which have used marker-based motion capture. Lifespan development. So measuring and tracking how people develop over time. So beginning as a child, as they were learning their gross motor movements and lifelong skills such as walking, jumping, and so on. And then as they develop and they go through growth spurts and their bodies change and finally become adults who are able to manipulate things in very fine detail with their hands and perform very powerful movements. So tracking people throughout their lifetime. Ballet, which involves incredibly technical and precise movement patterns in order to execute incredibly complex maneuvers. Bit of a different one, so it's an emerging area of research as the popularity of recreational pole dancing is growing. Because it is just an emerging pastime now, there isn't much research on it in the literature at the moment. So it's an open book. There's a whole lot of studies currently being undertaken at UWA looking at the physiology, the psychology and the motion, the biomechanics that goes into pole dancing. Working with musical instruments. These kind of studies might be looking at repetitive stress injuries, so repeating the same motion or holding the same stance for long periods of time, or repeating a motion over and over which results in injury. By measuring it, we might be able to develop better equipment or advise on better stances or positions which reduce injuries. Clinical research investigating disease and dysfunction, both the magnitude and the progression of such impairments. So for example, this clip shows the walking gait of a child with cerebral palsy, and through a biomechanical analysis using marker-based motion capture, the biomechanists were able to advise surgeons on help advise on corrective surgeries, which will hopefully lead to an improved walking gait a more comfortable lifestyle and an improved quality of life. Now, the area of clinical biomechanics is huge and not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. However, if you wish to look at further research or literature on clinical biomechanics, please check it out. They do some incredible work. And finally, ergonomics, so workplace, investigating the movements and the motions and the poses used in workplaces, designing better workstations, reducing loads, designing entire workplaces, aiming to reduce injuries and keep people working. There is an entire other industry that marker-based motion capture can be used for. It's not sport-based, however it is a bit of fun, so because we've been through a fair bit today, I've just thrown in a video off the Vicon website here, just a little bit of fun for the next couple of minutes. But my area of expertise, and what you guys are watching this lecture for, is the sport applications of marker-based motion capture. So the last 5 minutes, it's just got a video here taken from Red Bull's YouTube channel, looking at marker-based motion capture, Vicon system in action. The end of today's lecture. Thanks for sticking around all the way through. We managed to cover quite a bit today, so if you have any questions on any of the topics covered, please hit me up, email me at dennywells@outlook.com, or send me a tweet at Denny_Wells. Twitter, by the way, is a great place to get to stay up to date with the scientific community. A lot of scientists are on board, including in the biomechanics department. So if you're on there, have a look, and if you're not, I recommend checking it out. So yeah, if you have any questions, hit me up. Other than that, thanks for sticking around. Hope you enjoyed it, got something out of it, and might see you out there in the biomechanics community sometime. Alright, catch up.